This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
Hello and welcome to Body Count, a history podcast where we gab about death and disaster through the ages, highlighting figures, single events, time periods, culture, whatever it may be that resulted in someone, or as is usually the case, a lot of someone's dying. I am your host, Jessica Manor, and I am joined by my two fucking co-hosts.
Bethany Skelton
and Kara DiNemezio signing in.
That's the most joy we've ever had out of Kara saying hello. So I'm already pumped for what we're talking about tonight. But first, guys, as always, housekeeping. That's always going to be here and it's always going to say. So if you love this show, and we are available on all listening platforms, if you love this show, we ask that you go and give us those 5 stars. It really helps us out on the business end of things. It's so important that you all do it. We would really appreciate it.
Unless you
That
don't like
being
us,
said,
just ignore us. If you don't like us,
Yeah.
please don't even bother.
Yeah, please don't bother. We're not worth your time, internet, if you don't care for us. That being said, we are joined today by a guest who's currently making us a special guest. A wall of
guest.
degrees.
He's got a
wall.
God of tier of guests.
I don't like to brag.
Okay.
Okay, then go ahead and introduce yourself, Doctor.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am the ever so humble Dr. Warren Doctor, here to give you my very meager and honest and open opinions that in no way are verbose or over the top, and just honest, just easy facts. I'm here to blow your minds.
Can we pause for a second? I have to get my thesaurus if I'm going to be able to follow the rest of this. I can clearly tell I'm going to need it.
Oh my god,
Whoa.
presence of somebody so smart.
Straight from across the pond. He's been re-imported.
Re-imported.
He's back on track. He's focused, and his Twitter bio got more pretentious than it's ever been, guys.
He has that blue check mark, man. Like that blue check mark.
That means he's a
That's right.
person.
Like an actual
I'm a
person.
real human person.
That does
And
not
in
get
no
locked
way
out.
am I a vampire.
An actual human person, Jackie Daytona. So, first things first, go ahead, tell everybody, plug your book, plug whatever you're doing, plug where people can follow you so anybody that turns us off at the end doesn't miss it. I'm forcing you on our audience like you just have to be, like you do to us.
Oh. The daddy of body
Well.
count.
Oh.
The daddy of body count is here. You can follow me at Warren Doctor on Twitter. And if you're interested in my work, it's available in all fine bookshops and Amazon. It's called Churchill in the Islamic World, which I wrote. And recently, I've been working on an essay for a good buddy of mine, director Alan Packwood, about Churchill and intelligence and his role, him as a soldier, and the role that he played in experiencing intelligence sort of before intelligence was formalized in 1909.
Did you see that? Kara held your book up to the camera.
Oh, I didn't know she had a copy.
Yeah,
I'll
I got it for
sign
Christmas.
it for you. Yay!
Now I know. Now I need a book plate.
Ask for it to be signed, but I love that you're offering me to.
I need a book plate, man.
Because God knows she couldn't own it in good conscience unless you had, signed it yourself. But
That's true.
Seriously, that is super cool. Honestly, I'm just totally stoked to have you back on because you took me on a hell of a journey the last time.
He always takes women on journeys on body count, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
Oh, we go exploring. We reach out into a journey through time and space in the bushiest of fashions.
Yeah, I wouldn't have it any other
I'm on
way.
board this carriage.
Smell, color, see, sound, the Warren Doctor way. That being said, like he said, he's not talking about his book. If you want to hear about the book, can go back and listen to the previous series that Warren is on. It does very well in our listener numbers. So
And a nuance
again,
to Churchill, unlike what there apparently has been recently. So that's appreciated. Thank you.
yes.
I do try
Although-
to engage in actual scholarship.
Unlike other people that shall not be named, I suppose.
Exactly. So, as you know, that's what we're going to talk about today. He's already stated it. I love that he threw in the director part just to be extra pretentious, but we're going to ignore that.
He's a great man.
He is indeed. That'll never ever listen to this podcast, so God bless him. But you go ahead and start. Where are we starting? What are we doing? How are we diving into this?
And I'll just tell you what I want to sort of look at. So what we're going to be exploring here is Churchill's relationship with intelligence, and this is sort of broad. So espionage and his role, people know that Churchill was a soldier, and people don't know that Churchill's role as a soldier involved a lot of military intelligence, and that these experiences helped shape how he guided intelligence later on in the First World War, and then later, more importantly, in the Second World War, where he becomes hugely important at the center of things like Operation Fortitude South and Operation Fortitude North and Operation Mincemeat and the SOE and the sort of liberation of France. And a lot of the things that happened to him, these lessons that he learned as a soldier, which, by the way, is the name of the essay I'm writing, Learning Lessons, these experiences taught him. Jessica has eye-rolled at me, and I understand why. His lessons. So that's sort of what I'd like to talk about, is his experiences as a soldier, and how he got involved in military intelligence and how these experiences shaped his thinking later on.
Well, because he did a lot. I remember in the episodes that we did, those ended up being series. Might as well just say it was a series with you, Warren. I remember he really was heavily involved in World War I and continued kind of that mentality of, you know what, fuck that noise. I'm gonna actually do something about it. And I always actually thought that was really cool with him.
Yeah, I think the World War I element.
Like he was like in it, like, don't fuck with my country, don't fuck with my freedom, in a sense. Like maybe that, not in the right
Can
word.
I just say I'm incredibly offended? Bethany cannot recall more than 2 facts of all the journeys and things she's been on with me, but she can remember your series. So
She remembers Warren well.
You want to know
La-ti-da, Doctor.
You want to know why, Jessica? Because he was nice to me and didn't belittle my comments.
Wow, this turned quick on the Jerry Springer show. Or shall I say the Jessica Manor show.
He loves me more, Jessica. Okay.
Now, that being said, I've always been more intrigued by Churchill's World War I journey, I guess, because for me, it's not what's heavily focused on in the World War II mantra. I get like the World War II exploratory, that is social media. Everyone's always hyper fixated on Churchill as, well, prime minister, but specifically in the guise of the World War II years and how, he kind of rises from the ashes. But I've always been interested in kind of his series of failures, to be honest, and how he learned from them, because that's what people learn and develop from, right?
No, that's absolutely right. And I mean, I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Robert Rhodes James wrote a book called Churchill, A Study in Failure, which ends in 1939 before he becomes prime minister. And it sort of imagines him as it looks at his career up to that point as a sort of eccentric guy. And I mean, I think you're absolutely right about the fact that it is so saturated about Churchill in the Second World War. And it's because that's a part of the sort of British identity and the American mythos of fighting the good war and all that kind of stuff. And so Churchill's role as in the pantheon of that has to be quite substantial. But what I find myself is most interesting about Winston Churchill's career is the stuff that happened before. And I focus on stuff even in the 19th century, him as a young man, what shaped him, why does he think the way he thinks? And then we can see how that stuff plays out in the Second War. So that's what's born of this essay that I'm currently working on for Alan Packwood's book, which will be out with CUP. And that is to look at these experiences in the 19th century. And I mean, so we even go back before the First World War. And in many ways, what I'd like to take us up to today it takes us basically up to the Second or the First World War. We don't need to go beyond that to kind of illustrate the points that I'd like to make. And so the first place to say, of course, is to mention that the place to start, I guess, is that, Churchill joined, he went to Sandhurst to get his military education. And most of the military education in those days for him as a cavalry officer focused on them learning how to charge. Now, we think that that's kind of absurd today, right? But in the 1890s.
That wasn't unusual. That was kind of the last hurrah. I mean, up until World War I, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, Doctor, but you don't really see cavalry charges typically used after World War I. I mean, you have it at the beginning of the war, and then artillery and all of these new weapons make it fruitless endeavor. There's a huge ballpark figure, but millions of horses died in World War I too as a result of these.
What's really interesting about the horses is, and the use of a military charge, that all gets played out in the Boer War, which we're going to talk about, between South Africa and the British Empire. Yes.
Okay, so, like, when you say charge, like, are you talking about like a real like charge?
Yeah,
an actual traditional charge.
Oh,
so,
okay.
Exactly, like a cavalry charge.
Okay.
And what's really interesting about Churchill's career is he participated physically himself in the last full cavalry charge at the Battle of Omdurman during the Anglo-Dervish War in 1898.
I'll just say, I would think I've seen reenactments of actual charges, and I would not be down for. I wouldn't. No.
We wouldn't put you on a horse and say, charge?
No, they're all coming. No, I'm good.
But we'll have when we get to the Boer War, we'll explain why those tactics start failing. Now, there are later cavalry charges, and one is attempted in the First World War, but immediately everyone's killed. So you can see that this is a problem. So the place to start here, I think, sorry, my computer, I got an email. The place to start here, I think, is to say that before we get into this, it's important to know that, so Churchill, we know he went to Sandhurst, and then he joined the 4th Hussars and is placed to India and sort of lived the life of a cavalry officer who'd not seen much action. And a lot of these guys didn't see action. Now, Churchill, by the time he enters Parliament, has seen action in 4 major conflicts. He's been on 3 continents. So, I mean, he's a seasoned warrior by the time he joins Parliament in 1900. And a lot of these ideas about how the military is used and the tactics, intelligence, signals intelligence, which is, of course, an emerging field, right? And I'll explain the context around these things as we go through it. So the first place we need to start, I think, is in Cuba. So Churchill took a job as a war correspondent, and he went there with the Spanish Empire and looking at the Cuban insurrection, right? And in order to do this, he needed to get permission. And he approached his military superiors and told them that he wanted to go. And he was basically referred to the head of the intelligence division. And the head of the intelligence division told him that he was happy to go if he would work as an intelligence officer. So bear in mind, Churchill has this unique, interesting position whereby he's working as a press officer and an intelligence officer in his very first role.
Wow.
And the thing that they wanted to know, so the dispatches that he's writing back to the press are also dispatches that are going and being used for military purposes. Now, why this is interesting and important, contextually speaking, is that, military intelligence and all forms of intelligence at this point are basically a new science. it's kind of a gentleman's game. Nobody takes intelligence seriously that much, and it's kind of just what's discussed behind closed doors. It's hardcore military tactics and strategy and map making. That's kind of what you're looking at right now. There's not a lot of in-depth stuff. Now, in the naval side, you do get signals intelligence coming up in about the mid-1880s, right? Because if you send a group of ships somewhere, people have to be able to communicate to each other without talking, and so you get cryptographic intelligence and that kind of stuff because you need to talk in code, standard stuff. Well, because there's no kind of rules about how any of this stuff is done, press correspondents could also be intelligence officers. This is one of the really weird things that's happening. So the stuff that Churchill's writing back to the audience is also the stuff that he's kind of saying to the British kind of military thinkers. Yes.
So my question to you is, because you're right, he has this kind of dual role thing going on right now at this point. So when he would write back, was there any kind of censorship at this point in what he was doing? Like, was he, I mean, given we're not talking about like the importance of censorship in intelligence work quite yet, but I guess what kind of enthusiasm did he have over having this dual role so early on in his career?
Well, and I think he was more interested. I mean, that's a great question. I think he was more interested in being a war correspondent, honestly, than doing anything with intelligence. For him, the whole military career is essentially a trajectory to get him into politics and to make his name.
Like
and
ambition,
so you see
like
him do exactly. And he, because he saw his father die at such an early age, he was afraid that he would also die at an early age. And so he wanted to really push the boat out and try to get as much done as he possibly could.
I'm sorry, that man did the exact opposite than die at an early age.
Yeah, no, and he lived longer than they thought he would too, by a long shot.
For real, that man did the exact. He said, "I want to die at an early age," and he didn't. He didn't. He died so old.
No. He was. Let's see. He was born in 1874 and died in 1965. So he had pretty good innings.
Yeah.
Especially when you consider his habits too. Especially.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Absolutely. It's interesting. There was an article written in the early 90s called "The Churchill Factor," which is interesting because Boris Johnson named his book "The Churchill Factor." Anyway, in this article in the 90s, and it was in the Daily Mail or something, I think. Anyway, doctors argued that Churchill had this longevity
Jessica, are
because
you okay?
he drank so much that it thinned his blood out.
Are you okay, Jess?
What?
I laughed. I'm sorry. Y'all go on. I was laughing and I just spit.
Jessica would be a shit spy, for the record.
Or
the
is that what she wants you to think?
It's coming full circle because we first thought Bethany would be the shit spy, and then it's not. Then I'm a little like suspect with Jessica's reaction there to the Churchill factor. So,
so he goes out there, and one of the things that the head of the military division told him, who was of course someone that his mother knew. So again, this is all about social networks. There was a real serious change in around this time at the end of the 19th century in small weapons manufacturing, and some people even call this the revolution of small arms. And what had happened was people were using rifles and powdered rifles. So, for instance, the British military at the time used a Henry Martini Mark II, right, which was kind of standard. It was accurate up to 600 yards. But then along comes Mauser, and Mauser creates a rifle that's accurate up to 1,000 yards, and in some cases more, depending on what thing you have. But that's not even that important. What's more important is that he came up with a 757 millimeter bullet and smokeless gunpowder. And this is revolutionary. This is game changing. And Churchill is sent to Cuba to find out about this bullet and about the effects of these rifles, because the Spanish bought these Mausers to use against the insurrectionists in Cuba. So that's where Churchill first sees action, and is first fired upon is in Cuba while he's out there, and he does write about these weapons and sends them back to the press and, for everyone to see. So we know that he sort of accomplishes his mission about sort of finding out the effectiveness of these rifles. And you can see this in his writing and in his dispatches. And it became a real interesting thing. Now, the British didn't want to invest in the Mauser rifles yet because they're sort of too expensive, and they had so many Henry Martinis Mark IIs lying around that they thought, look, we're good to go. Whatever, we're the British Empire, and we got a cavalry charge. Who's going to mess with us?
So basically, big dick energy, essentially.
They got big dick energy in the biggest
massive.
way.
Say that. It's like, we got some big dicks. Just grab your big dick that's lying around. That one will do, and charge. Literally.
Exactly.
With the martinis,
see,
with the old
what's
guns.
Really interesting is so that Churchill's first, I think, role in the military world, even though it's as a war correspondent and he's just there kind of taking notes. So for Britain, it's a time of peace. He's out there literally spying on the Spanish Empire, trying to find out what kind of guns they got, because that affects the arm race back in Europe, right? Which affects the arm race elsewhere in the British Empire. So all these things exist in a network, and it's important to understand that. So the next, if we move along away, and I am trying to move this because I know that the last time I was here we did 5 episodes.
Whoops. That's my fault. It's my fault.
It's all of our faults.
Wow.
So Churchill is
Body count daddy.
Can I just say, body count #daddy? You're going to talk to your finish. So you're like in this for the long haul, one way or the other. Like,
I know that. Yeah, no, I'm going to keep talking. I mean, have you heard my voice, my dulcet tones?
Have you met me? Those dulcet tones of Doctor.
I'm voice pretty, ladies.
There's another expression for that, but it escapes me.
I have somniferous tones.
I'm sorry. Let me get my thesaurus again, Doctor.
Wow. Shit. I should grab mine at this point.
Oh, I like to drop the big words because I got one of those calendars that tells me big words.
He's a cheater. I get it now.
Yeah, exactly.
Word of the day, Dick. Look at him getting on his notes.
So
yeah, my notes is just word
to tie it back, to loop us back in, because I want to give Bethany an idea of the global network you kind of hinted at. So how would you describe in Bethany terms the kind of global network you're describing? Like in a visual, if you could visually describe it, if that makes sense.
Well, let's see. Into the 19th century, traditionally, scholars refer to this era as the Great Game. And because the two major powers in the world, right, are the Russian Empire and the British Empire. So what you've got here is a classic situation where the Kansas City Royals are playing off against their number one enemy. I don't know who that is, Bethany. Who do the Kansas City Royals hate?
Well, the Royals, I'm not sure, but with the Chiefs, it'd be like the Raiders or the Broncos, that kind of thing.
Okay, let's imagine the Chiefs are playing against the Raiders, and this has been going on for about a half a century.
I mean, it kind of has, but yeah.
Yeah.
It's
exactly.
like the Packers. It's like the Packers and the Lions, or the Packers and the Bears kind of shit going on.
Exactly, but the thing is, right, they're not the only players on the field. There's lots of different empires, and they're all trying to figure out what each other's doing.
You have Germany emerging.
The rise of Germany is huge.
And like nobody's really on a side. Everybody just hates everybody, or are we on side?
They're all in it for their own motivations. I mean,
that's right. You don't see. So this is traditionally this is what Britain was called an era of splendid isolation, because they did not try to seek out an alliance with anyone, because the Empire and Commonwealth was their alliance. Whereas you do have alliances under the Bismarckian system starting to develop in Europe. So like all them on the continent is sleeping around, Bethany. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, so continental Europe is like all up in each other, okay? But then England's like, meh, we have our own. We have our colonies. We'll just rely on them, if that makes sense. So, thinking India, for example, would be a common.
Back up, hoe. I got my hoe on speed dial. Like, we're good.
India's the hoe on speed dial.
Exactly. And India is, for the sake of this argument, now this is what's interesting. A lot of intelligence historians will point to the fact that intelligence, a lot of people, I think, mistakenly think intelligence starts in 1909 for Britain when MI6, MI5 were formed officially. But of course, that's not the case. Huge, vast intelligence networks were developed in India and in Egypt through the late 19th century to
Egypt
help
is really important.
colonial administration. Yeah. And a guy named Christopher Bailey wrote really, really good books on using sort of Indian archives to explore these things. And there's another great book, Empire of Information is one. There's another book, Martin Thomas has done that about the French Empire. I mean, and so anywhere that had colonial holdings inwardly into their own subjects is developing these huge, sophisticated networks of espionage and intelligence systems. Whereas you don't see it happening so much against other powers. So there is still this idea that, famously, Henry Stimson said in the 1920s, gentlemen don't read one another's mail. Well, Britain was reading their colonial subjects' mail since like the 1850s, really since 1857 after the Sepoy Mutiny. And France has been doing the same thing. But Britain and France hadn't been reading each other's mail officially, but of course they were. It's just that nothing had been organized about how it was being done. It was all in private networks.
It wasn't Facebook official.
It was not Facebook official. That's correct.
Yeah.
I like that. They're just they're basically Tinder flirting right now. Yep. Like nobody's slidden into anybody else's DMs yet. You get what I'm saying?
There's no swipe right on the espionage yet officially, as far as intelligence work.
Or they were sliding into the DMs, but they were keeping it low key.
It's defo low key.
I like that, low key. So it's unofficial. Exactly.
Officially unofficial. That's where we're at. That's part of the vibes. I can totally feel the vibes between all. It really
so Europe's
is.
looking at each other in suspicion with England, particularly, right? Like, think about it from that point of view. They're like, hey, we all understand these peeps. What's their game, right?
What are they up to? And you have this situation where, like, obviously Germany is in the 1890s is rising, but not a total threat yet. And the people aren't really clear about what Germany's going to do. And the big baddie on the block is Russia, because Russia is trying to control all of Asia, and they're afraid it's going to move through the Hindu Kush and take over India. So Britain's like, what the hell? And that's where a lot of the tension is. And this is where the great game comes from. Or as it's called in Russian, the Tournament of Shadows, which is my next
Good God, I
album.
love that. I love that. That does sound like a killer album, honestly.
I want that on a t-shirt. I want that on a t-shirt so bad.
Guys, we need merch. I don't know why the Body Count podcast hasn't created merch yet, but we got to do this.
We do.
I agree.
Well, because somebody's making a website. There's a stink bug in my whiskey. Well, that's not going to be our merchandise anymore, Bethany. We're going to put it on our website, which I am building, which, as we all know, I'm a Luddite and I'm bad at it. Hashtag bad at it.
Hashtag bad at it, but that's a shirt. Hashtag bad at it.
We already
He got that marketing mind.
Yeah, he does. He very much does. Kara had a good one the other day that when it comes to history, hashtag I am Bethany, because in a way, somewhere out there, we're all a Bethany.
That's very true.
I have a
very smart ass.
I am Bethany question right now.
Yeah.
You said where we're at with the Russians. I guess, can you put time frame? Because I have learned a lot about them. So I guess I'm trying to put into time frame of what's going on.
Ladder Romanovs, yeah.
Yeah.
Like where it's at.
I'm so bad with dates, but it feels like we should be in certain time frame where the Romanovs or some sort of, not Ottomans, because that's before them, right? Or kind of
no.
The Ottomans still exist.
Still a
technically.
thing.
They're the sick man in a way, but
not relevant. You know what I mean? Like the Ottomans had their thing, and then they kind of got ran out of town, kind of thing.
I mean, they're definitely hobbling, but they're still in town.
No, right? No. You know what I mean? Like it's a different.
Yeah, I mean,
Anyway.
It's not the
so
primary objective
right
for
now,
Russia
the Ottoman
anymore.
Empire is being propped up. I mean, that's a part of the great game, right? Is that the Ottoman Empire is being propped up by Britain and France against Russia because Russia's the main bad guy, right? In from the view.
Some
Oh,
things
wait.
never change.
I was gonna say the bad guy.
But and Russia remains the sort of main bad guy on the block until the Russo-Japanese War in 1905.
Which that was a ass kicking.
That took the air right out, like took the wind out of old Russia's sails in a hurry.
In fact,
It did. I mean, that was
it
sort
made
of
Britain feel quite great. Less
Exactly.
exactly.
Pretty damn
They were like,
good.
these guys aren't taking anything. They can't even defend themselves against Japanese attacks. They got nothing. These guys are a joke. They're a clown show. So the Russian Empire kind of got revealed to be not what they had led everyone to believe that they were.
Like a charade, kind of.
Everybody just took a sigh of relief and said, whew, there's a people in dire need of mechanization right there.
That's exactly it, which is really interesting, just to go back to your point, Kara, saying that they're the sick man. I mean, there's a great argument that I think is quite interesting by an author named Ephraim Karsh, who argues actually, everyone talks about the Ottomans being the sort of weakest link, but in fact, the Ottomans outlived the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So their primary enemies, they actually outlived them, not by long, but
But technically,
the Ottomans,
yeah,
exactly. So not as weak as they might have appeared. Anyway, so now, and the reason I bring up all this imperial context is because Churchill then goes to India, is stationed in India, and again becomes a war correspondent for the Pioneer and was it the Allahabad Pioneer and I think the Daily Mail. Is that right? Or the Morning Post? No, the Morning Post is later. Anyway, he becomes another war correspondent and does his very best to get involved in what later becomes known as the Malacan Field Force. And so this is his first experience of a colonial war where he's a part of the empire sort of going out on punitive expeditions fighting against kind of local jihadist tribes that today would exactly make up the Taliban, right? So you see a sort of historical thing happening here, and this is another place where Churchill gets deeply involved with military intelligence. So again, as a cavalry officer, his job, besides being a war correspondent, is to oh no, okay. It just said there's bad network something going on. That could be me. I don't read it right.
I can hear you well.
Okay.
Yeah. I can hear you well. I don't know. I just know that 20th century historians everywhere just got hard when you got to the topic that you're talking about right now. So I could hear, maybe that was the network connection. All 20th century historians getting hard at the same time. Yeah.
So it turns out, ladies and gentlemen, history repeats itself.
What? No, it rhymes. It rhymes.
Mark Twain did not say.
Mark Twain did not say that. Just FYI.
That's good merch idea. Mark Twain did not say that.
Mark Twain never said that. That's pretty good. But anyway, so Churchill learns a lot about what, he starts writing treatises, right, on how the cavalry should be used for reconnaissance. And that actually they're used in a military capacity to go out to do scouting to come back and say where the enemies are. Rather than just running off and charging or try to do punitive expeditions, they should be used to gather intelligence in the field, which makes sense.
Anyone that's played Civ 6 knows that. Anyone that
exactly. You need a scout. I play as the Germans.
Why am I not surprised?
Shocker. Fucking color me shocked.
I always play as the Russians, inexplicably.
Again, color me shocked.
What I'm hearing is we're going to have a Civilization 6 off, y'all, and I'm going to take over the world.
Shit.
I mean, if anybody's a born dictator.
He'll be the Gandhi, so he'll be the one that inexplicably nukes everyone. Because that's what's happened since Civ 3.
What is happening right now? I have no idea what any of y'all are talking about.
We nerded out so hard just then.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I went into like nerd, like ultra.
You know those games your husband plays? This is some of the stuff he's doing.
She looks
That
like
was
she's
an
seen,
eye
like,
roll for the ages right there. Like that is,
listeners,
if
you
I
couldn't
could
see that,
capture
but
that.
you could see the whites of her eyes in that moment.
That really
Yeah.
delighted me. So Churchill befriends intelligence officers who and comes up with all these theories about how intelligence, how cavalry should be used for intelligence. And he also borrows some of their own thinking because he starts arguing he writes essays to military magazines saying, look, there needs to be a difference between a sort of tactical intelligence kind of cavalry reconnaissance officer and a political intelligence officer. The political intelligence officer needs to know the languages and the lay of the land and the people, but tactics and stuff should be left to the military side, because if you've got one side trying to do the other side, they don't really understand what they're supposed to be doing.
That's
So
like
he's calling for sort of
that's like a PE teacher all of a sudden becoming a sex ed educator. You know what I mean?
exactly.
It just no.
Never the two should meet.
It just
Yeah,
jives like
exactly.
2 seconds. It just you're not. It's not gonna work.
Are you saying they're sword
That's
fighting in a sense?
Yeah.
Oh, major
Yes.
sword fighting.
Just
Tip to tip, nothing's happening.
A little
you've
bit of
got a
docking.
filthy
A little bit
mind.
of docking going on.
Ting 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 ting.
Docking. Oh God, Kara with the win. Oh my God,
the
Kara, you
obvious-
just made my whole
If
night.
anyone could see what Warren
No, it's
and
just that
Jessica
I
were
didn't
doing,
expect docking from Tara. That's all.
She's the one that will surprise you. She sneaks in with shit like that. You don't even know.
it's the
She
witty
sneaks
banter.
in.
You save it. You save it for the right moment.
See
That
here.
was well executed. You have just received a banter sniper award from me.
A tactical scout.
Yeah,
You better-
tactical.
Ha
Better
ha!
frame it and put it on your wall. Here.
I know, it'll be my
Yeah,
gold
yeah.
star of approval
looks
from a
like one of
verified Twitter
these.
user. Actually, I do like the one that's like adjacent to your main certificate, like the one that's like a little black and white.
That one.
Yeah, it looks like
It's
a shopping
probably
bag.
an award. Don't encourage
No,
him.
no,
Don't
no,
fucking
no.
encourage him.
That's my PhD.
He put that bag in the cart.
Y'all fucking encouraged him. Why did you encourage him? God. Oh,
Let me tell you about all the awards I won while I was doing that PhD.
oh,
He stares off into the
Should I break
sunset.
it down chronologically or should I do it alphabetically?
Can we do another podcast for that, or
It'll
I've
have
got
to be
so
a
many
series,
people.
Bethany.
I've got so many people I'm tagging in this episode, by the way, just for shit like that.
vibe
I want
the vibe I got from you, Warren, on that was like, oh, this old thing.
That exactly what it was. The false
Listeners,
humility is
He is
amazing.
wearing a beret. I thought
We
And
asked,
a scarf.
we requested those things.
it was
So
requested. It was requested. So to record a body count, you must have and don proper attire.
that is correct. And I'm just ashamed that right now, because it's packed away, I couldn't wear my Cambridge robes for you. In
I was
addition,
going to
Top
say,
hat.
he's
I would've-
going to
I
say
would've done the
something
top hat.
about Cambridge robes in a minute. Like, give it fucking 15 seconds. And
I
there
want
it
every
Where's
is.
the
one of your-
Churchillian cigar? That's the question.
He abandoned it. Because
yeah,
he's a
it's over.
poser.
When I put you ladies in my bed, I left it over there on the desk.
You body count hashtag daddy.
Daddy.
You. Hashtag sweater daddy.
He gets the
That's
first
me.
body count hashtag daddy award.
I mean,
Yeah.
how many times do you get to say that you had 3 of us in your bed? Like, come on, like it's pretty
Very
awesome.
difficult. Very rare.
You're now the player of the podcast world, by the way, because, you know.
Hello,
I
ladies.
have the connections.
That's I'm saying, and it's a unique amalgamation of hot too that he's dealing with. So like,
I think it's
look at
beard.
him.
I think it's
It is.
the well.
I always call it his facial Yggdrasil. It's like the tree of the world is on his face. It's where all his knowledge is hidden in.
And meanwhile, the producer's like,
no, he's like, you know what? This is one of the more normal. No, he's not. He's going to be like, this is one of the more normal conversations, quite frankly, y'all have ever had. Period.
That's probably true. There are whole episodes, boys and girls, that we recorded that had to be destroyed.
I mean,
what?
There's one episode that is in the series of Warren that actually had to be completely deleted and redone because somebody.
I got blackout drunk, Kara.
The body
like,
count tape.
Blackout drunk.
And she gave a piece of her mind, and I was like, Jessica, we're recording right now.
I think of Jessica as a very, very
so
close
red.
friend, and I have never been so aggressively. I've had to wrestle with some hard customers from time to time. I have never been so. That was a tough thing, and I had to keep saying, "You invited me here."
I'm just picturing in my head, and I'm like seeing flames right now, Jessica.
Oh, she had. It was literally like a cartoon character. Like, even to this point, I still don't know what set her off because I think I was like still just trying to like blindly follow along what was happening, and then like all of a sudden just was like,
So
no,
this is why I'm on the show, is it? Because we have to prevent a redux.
She was just like, I'm
Yeah.
not talk anymore. I'm gonna say what I need to say, and he's gonna hear it. And not that only.
And it was about 30% coherent. I mean, whatever it was she was saying was like, yeah, I guess.
Oh no, it's like Wolf of Wall Street. Have you guys seen that? Where he's like on Quaaludes, right? It's literally, that's what I'm picturing right now. Like him when he's like on Quaaludes, like crawling into the freaking like.
Let me put it
You're
the next.
not wrong.
You're not. When I woke up the next morning and was looking at a series of text messages, I'm like, what the fuck are these two assholes even talking about? They're like making up shit that happened. And then I listened to about half of that and I was like, oh, sweet Jesus.
We
Nope.
worked together, Jessica. I messaged Warren. I was like, she's not normally like that.
Bethany for the PR. Bethany like, oh, sweet Jesus.
It was like having to do a podcast in a lake of lava is how I would describe that. And Bethany doing her very best to be like, no, we'll put water on it. We'll put water. It's fine. Just keep going.
So like this raging fire with little Bethany with her little bucket trying to put it out as it continues to spew. Good God.
Jessica, stop it.
Jessica.
And I mean, I think I don't know. I don't remember, Bethany. Maybe you. I don't know. I don't remember if I was nice the whole time or if I stopped being nice and started burning stuff. I don't remember.
And adding to the pyre.
I think we started burning shit together.
Well,
you sound way too happy about that fact. You're just very smiley right now, and it's perturbing.
Well, eventually,
I did have a lot of fun.
Hold on. Warren, to answer your question, eventually it became to the point where we were no longer laughing. And I think that you started to stay more quiet because every time you tried to put your knowledge forth,
2 cents.
Jessica was like, oh, and another thing. How about that? Let me tell you about that, mister. And just went to school. I was like, well, this was...
You know what? I guarantee what set me off was the thing that always sets me off that Oren says. And it's because it's so very true as he sits in front of his fucking PhD. I'm sure it was, well, I am the authority. And he is, but I resent it deeply.
Gentleman on those episodes, Jessica. He was fantastic. So I'm just so happy to have him back.
As you paint him as a fucking saint. Okay, fine. We're gonna go on. We're gonna go on because now we're just getting into
in real life.
territory.
I'm a real bastard.
He's
Okay.
a real asshole.
So to drive it back in, where were we in the
So we're on the northwest frontier, and Churchill arguing about how reconnaissance and cavalry should be used.
That's right.
As
Our
well
Civ
as
Six situation.
Exactly, the Civ 6 situation, which is how we got off there. And so he starts writing the arguing about this and about the role of political intelligence officers versus sort of tactical intelligence officers. And he actually writes into the military magazine and argues that this distinction should be made after his own sort of interviews with other intelligence officers and why they thought that was important. Now, in the interim here, and I need to raise this.
Wait,
Churchill
can I
was
ask a quick question? So is that a consensus among most people in the field, what he's writing about?
At the time.
Is that like a feeling at the time? As far as approaching intelligence that way, is that a consensus?
So no is the answer. I think because so few people were writing, I don't know if you could say a consensus had developed yet.
Okay.
But what, for instance, David Stafford argues in his book about Churchill and the Secret Service is that Churchill, not that he plagiarized some of the military intelligence officers he had spoken to, but he heavily leans on them in his writings because he's a journalist, right? So essentially he's doing kind of journalistic writings. He's not trying to be a military theorist, but he does want to kind of secretly low-key make his name as a military theorist.
So he's kind of like, while I'm doing this, let me add my 2 cents and see if I can make some waves going on.
That's exactly it. So he after the Malacan Field Force kind of completes its mission, he goes back to India. He plays polo. And so he's not out fighting wars all the time. He's also kind of living the life of Riley and kind of living up and really enjoying colonial India, which, as we know, for all sorts of problems now is problematic and was problematic then, particularly if you were Indian. But one of the things that happens here, and this is a key thing, as you'll see in a second, is...
Good understatement, Warren. I know. Good understatement.
I'm sorry, the Academy has just given me your Understatement of the Year award. Oh, wow. That's
Somebody
a big trophy.
has adopted British mannerisms in his stint across the sea.
I obviously know nothing of the historical content, but you've already called India a side chick, so I can only imagine the drama with this. So, I don't really know everything.
To be
There is
fair,
so much drama, Bethany. So much.
Imperial side piece.
And it's guaranteed drama. So I may not fully understand historically what's going on, but I'm getting the picture.
Well, so it's interesting that you mentioned that. So this is real important. In one of the polo tournaments, he really hurts his shoulder, okay? And it gets dislocated, and this becomes really problematic and important later on. He then goes to one of the British Empire's other side pieces, which is Egypt.
Shit.
I've heard of this side piece.
Yeah. And Egypt and India, they kind of know about each other, but Europe doesn't know what's going on. Oh, it's dirty. They're doing real dirty stuff.
I mean,
I'm pretty sure
geographically,
Egypt and India have been on. I'm pretty sure they're all like K brothers and sisters. Yeah. Jessica knows.
Geographically, there's no way they wouldn't. You know what I mean? Be
right. And
know of that.
And to be fair, side pieces usually know about other side pieces. It's just kind of like a known fact. So that makes sense.
Snap.
They were texting about it. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, there was some pretty serious texting
at my house last night. Well, he came over 2 nights ago, so bitch.
Exploiting these resources. Exploit my resources for once. Like,
Get on my resource. My cotton production is superior to your cotton production.
Jump on my subcontinent, would you? Jesus.
Ladies, I'm going to explore all your resources. Come down. There's plenty of empire to go around, ladies.
I'm going to
I'll
exploit
all
of y'all.
There's a little tear.
That's how the British Empire.
That is how the British Empire rolled.
The British Empire can be summed up quite simply by thinking of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia when he's like, "Look, D, you either go get or you get got. I go get."
I go get.
I'd agree.
I'm a 5-star man.
I'm a 5-star empire
man. Yeah. Oh.
One for mom.
Now, Bethany, what would be the weaknesses you would think that an island in the sea would have with having such a vast, because obviously there are advantages to having colonies, but what are there any disadvantages, Doctor, that would have made obviously there are, you and I both know, but explain the disadvantages. How about that?
of having an empire.
No, specifically
No.
of how like intelligence communications would work.
Right. So they're no, okay. So in terms of how intelligence develops is, this creates a real issue between the colonial administrators and whom you rule, because then effectively you're creating secret police in the same way the Stasi or Gestapo or, Cheka or any of those kind of things worked. And so you build up a lot of resentment. Now, there are different models that took place. It's not the same model because the British Empire is a hodgepodge of nonsense. There's nothing logical about any of it. And so what's going on in India is completely different than what's going on in Egypt and how it's administered and administered and so forth. Because technically, Sudan becomes a colony, but Egypt is a dependent, but is also a dependent of the Ottoman Empire. And so the Egypt can't sign into any legal official agreement with Britain without the Ottoman Sultan signing off. And so it formally becomes what's called a condominium.
It's like
a condo. It's your grandma's condo.
Ah, so good. Oh, that's so good.
I was actually going to say Egypt sounds like she caught feelings is all I was going to say. It feels like
she couldn't act on it. She could caught feelings but couldn't act on it.
That's true. And that's because Egypt's still in a relationship with the Ottomans and has been since about, 1300.
They double dipping.
They double dipping big time.
But they see what else is out there, man. So
and shit had fizzled, right?
Maybe someone else can exploit my resources. And here's the thing: before we jump into the River War, or what Churchill called the River War, and he wrote a really good book about that. And in terms of his intelligence writing, his book on it, the River War, isn't so much based on intelligence as it is on the sort of long history and culture of what Britain was doing in Egypt. And it's important as well here to note that this is a place where Churchill had worked with a guy named Horatio Kitchener, who, of course, is a famous guy that from the poster, right, in the First World War. And Churchill develops a real disliking of him because of his brutal methods. And what Kitchener's quite genius at is not necessarily that he's that brutal, although later in the Boer War he did institute concentration camps. That's a fact, kids. So he is quite a brutal guy, but he is a real sort of like logistical kind of autistic approach to war. So one of the problems with fighting the Mahdists through the 1880s down in Sudan for Britain was they'd run out into the desert and then Britain would follow and then they'd get lost in the desert and come back. And they couldn't really accomplish anything. And they would try to use the Nile. Well, Kitchener says, you know what? Forget all that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to build railways, and we're going to do this bit by bit, and it's going to be slow, and it's going to be monotonous and sort of tactically done all the way along. And Kitchener goes down there as the Sardar, which is an honorary title, which is essentially the head of the military. But even though he's British, he's the head of the Egyptian military, which is weird. But he gets that position. And he rebuilds painstakingly over the course of years the Egyptian military and turns it into a real serious fighting force with a real serious military intelligence apparatus. And they slowly start moving into modest territory in the Sudan, slowly securing the desert against these sort of the modest rebellion. And then it's at that point Churchill comes over and joins. And one of the stories that's real interesting here, and like I say, the primary focus of his work on this is not so intelligence focused, but there is a real important, well, two important things that I think happen, maybe three. And the first one is that, so Churchill's out on patrol doing his reconnaissance thing, and he comes across a dervish. Remember, one of the modest, a dervish. And he's so excited he's going to catch his own prisoner of war. He disarms the guy, he wraps him up, puts him behind his pony, and is going to take him back to camp. So he slowly brings this guy back to camp, only to discover that this guy isn't a dervish at all. He's actually an agent who had infiltrated the dervish army. So Churchill had accidentally captured one of his own. Exactly. And it's really interesting. So he records this in the first edition of the River War, that this had happened in his embarrassment. And then in the second edition, he cuts that out. And then in his autobiographical account in the 1930, he doesn't mention it at all. So he's clearly very embarrassed by the fact that he was taken in. And one of the things that becomes very clear in the book, if you read the first edition, is he is utterly captivated at how amazingly capable these spies are, because they fooled him. And, he talks about their bravery and the fact that, Kitchener's slowly closing this line. And even up to the last day before the charge, there's still spies going back and forth. And he talks about this sort of what Christopher Bailey would call a kind of empire of information that Kitchener was able to build up around the Mahdi, and that all his courts had been penetrated by British spies. And that's how they were able to get all this information. Churchill becomes really interested in this stuff, right? And it sounds a lot like what Churchill does in the Second World War with Operation Double Cross, right? Where they take the German spies and flip them. So you can see a lot of this groundwork is being laid here. Now, the next important thing is the actual battle itself. And this is something I know we're the body count podcast. So we know that Churchill, I think, gets 4 confirmed kills. And I think all of them were basically at this charge. And he almost gets killed himself during the cavalry charge, and he takes part in the official charge. They blow the bugle, they're running in, and there's a certain moment when he gets thrown from his horse. And a lot of historians, including Andrew Roberts and even Martin Gilbert, argued that if Churchill had been carrying the lance, he would have been killed. But he didn't carry the lance because his arm had been dislocated in the polo tournament. And so instead he was able to use his rifle as his side piece, see what it did, and wasn't using an actual literal lance. So he was able to draw that on swordsmen because he got separated from the kind of wave and got surrounded and had to fight his way out. And so that's one of those amazing, really interesting moments where who knows what could have happened.
Who said that phrase? Don't bring a knife to a gunfight, or don't bring a sword to a gunfight.
That's exactly it. Well, he rocks
Kara,
up with a gun.
Kara, you had a question?
Yeah, a question and a comment. First off,
Good.
I'm not a big fan of Roberts as a biographer because I'm not sure he's objective. Both, I've read his Napoleon and I've read his work on Churchill, and I have a hard time buying him. However, that's my comment aside. It is intriguing because this is where you emphasized the importance of like the earlier injury, and as a result of that injury being so significantly impactful in this particular moment. That's wild. So no, I didn't have a question. I had a comment.
Really interesting. And just to note, I mean, I don't know if you know this. There's no reason you would. I know that Jessica knows this because I talked to her about it. I've had to fight Andrew Roberts on a number of occasions on BBC Radio and other places, arguing about various things. Andrew Roberts and I are I'm going to say, pretty decent friends. And despite all of our disagreements, have been able to sort of be cordial and nice to one another and respectful. I have tremendous respect for him as a historian and biographer. I think it's impossible to read his Churchill and think this guy, he sees Churchill in rose-colored glasses and he wants his readers to know it. And so is he an objective biographer? Probably not.
But I will say, in his defense, he wants his readers to know it. Like, it's never a fucking question.
I mean, doesn't an author really want, though, that to be illustrated whenever they're writing something? Like how they not view it isn't the right phrase, but why they would feel that way, if you will.
Well,
feel
I think that's
justified.
an interesting point, because I think if you're going to write or talk about anything, the entire point is to be objective. So I guess it's just a question of methodology.
Well, it's interesting because Churchill was a war correspondent, okay? So you get later into World War II and objectivity's out the fucking window.
Well, one of the really interesting things here, and this is, I should have mentioned this in Cuba, and it's one of the things he talks about in the River War as well, is he talks about how important censorship is. And so he learned from the Spanish, who absolutely did control. You asked that question earlier, and we didn't get to cover it. The Spanish had a really good control over what got off the island and what was circulated around the island. But there's something more important that Churchill picked up in Cuba, and that was that the guerrilla opponents, the insurrectionists, were using guerrilla tactics, hit and run tactics, and they honestly didn't give a shit. So the censorship, it played very little part. But Churchill himself, despite being a war correspondent who pushed for open freedom of press things as a young man, as we see in the First World War, and then especially in the Second World War with the D notices, essentially is like, I'm closing it down. Yeah. So let's see. We talked about the first thing hold on. I'll get there. So, and we talked about his shoulder and how he had to use that piece, and then that fact. Now, he got lots of help in writing the River War because, as you know, that initially the first volume of that is a 2-volume book, and he used we went to the intelligence division and got them to help them with all the maps and inserts in the book. So he had sort of been given a blessing by the intelligence division to put and use this information that had been gathered by all these spies he was so impressed with. And he developed really good relationships with this intelligence operation. So much so that Churchill afterwards resigned his position because he thought that he might be able to go back to Britain, and he sort of resigned out of the military, right? And he thought that he could go in 1899 and try to get into politics, which he tried, and he ran in a by-election and lost. But in the interim, he thought, oh, what can I do? So he was looking for a military position that would keep him in Britain, but he could still be in the military. And we know from the Churchill documents there are at least 2 or 3 letters where he wrote, one of which was to his mother and one was to Ian Hamilton, and also to Elmer Haldane, who is one of his friends, about feeling out whether or not he could himself get into the intelligence branch, and speculatively thinking about joining up formally into the intelligence branch. So what he decides instead is to remain as a journalist, and of course all this tension's been building in South Africa, which brings us to the Boer War. And Churchill himself joins after his election defeat and his speculation about joining the intelligence branch. He decides, he's making a lot of money. He's one of Britain's very well-known journalists, and he goes to the South African War, to the Boer War, to work as a journalist. And he at that time he holds no military position. And almost as soon as he gets there, he gets on at Durban to take an armored train, and it gets attacked by these Boers. Now, I want to pause here because there's some things we need to lay about what's happening in the Boer War. It's at the Boer War where Britain kept using these tactics I was talking about, cavalry charges and so forth, still holding on to these old Martini Henry rifles. And the Boers had been using Mausers, and the Boers had their own very sophisticated battle tactics. It's a lot closer to what we think of as battle tactics today. That's right. So they have snipers. They use cover. They don't march in lines in the middle of the road. Their
accuracy is a lot better from a farther distance.
And they use smokeless rifles. So they're the cavalry charge, and there are a few generals who've gone on record saying, "Look, we try." And the second that we get lined up, they just shoot us all down. We lose men left and right. We can't use this.
Gee, I wonder how that happened.
Exactly. And you have this thing where the British military is sort of so stagnant, they don't know what to do with the cavalry because they can't use the cavalry how they've been using the cavalry for 100 years against the Boers. The Boers have very sophisticated tactics. Now, the other contextual thing you need to know about the British operation is that their intelligence unit in the Boer War in South Africa, in Pretoria, in the Orange State, and the other sort of South African republics is trash. It's a clown show. To give you an idea, the budget there, when John Ardagh, who was an Irishman who was in the British Empire, who came in and took control of it, and wrote, this is remarkable. And Churchill himself writes about this in his own, in My Early Life and in his own history of the Boer War, which is called London to Ladysmith via Pretoria, and also Ian Hamilton's March. So it's a 2-volume set. Anyway, John Ardagh writes before or the lead up to the sort of Boer War a thing about Boer tactics and saying, look, the Boers are better soldiers than us. It's going to take at least 200,000 men for us to go in here and stop them. And he sends this sort of based on his intelligence reports, this really accurate 2-volume book over to the people who are running the war, including the general Redvers Buller, who everyone called Buller, and the state, I can't think of the guy's name. I should know this. It's not Salisbury, who's basically the Secretary of the State of War. And he sends it over to him, and within an hour, it's returned to John Ardagh, and they say, we know everything there is to know about the Boer War, about Boers and about South Africa.
Well, we know what's going to happen.
Exactly. We know exactly what's going to happen. And Churchill himself talked about how foolish these men were because they refused to listen to the intelligence. And what most intelligence historians who work on the Boer War, and this is a real moment in the development of British intelligence. So you do have a lot of military intelligence,
It's
and
a
Christopher Andrews
confrontation
writes
of old and new, really. Like you have your classically trained people that just thought, okay, we know what there is to know because we've observed and we've seen and we've been colonizers, even though they have to be aware on some level that they're being outflanked, they're being outgunned quite literally in both tactics and in sheer arms.
Well, especially
and then you have the nuance of the new.
Well, especially
Sorry, Bethany.
I was just going to add, like, especially even as an outsider, we've already established that they were like, help, we're being gunned down. You know what I mean? So obviously they're struggling because their war tactics aren't working. And they wouldn't
have this to begin with if they were so, how do I put it, brilliant and knew everything there was to know.
Exactly. And I mean, this is what's really remarkable.
We know everything, even though we're losing. We don't need help. We got this.
Exactly. And they keep coming in and giving these guys these old rifles and telling them to do what they've always done, and they keep losing. And, this eventually culminates in a thing called Black Week, where there are 3 major battles that are lost that were catastrophic for the British forces there, and General Buller was basically dismissed after this. But here's what's remarkable. John Ardagh put together this huge report, and in it he said, listen, basically one Boer soldier, just a Boer soldier, is worth 5 to 7 British soldiers. That's how good they are. And of course, Buller and the Secretary for War said, look, this is nonsense. Lord Lansdowne, that's who it was, and got rid of it. And didn't want to listen
that's
to
how
it.
You quash things.
Wait. This is the most remarkable thing about this really accurate thing that John Ardagh put together. His budget, his entire budget for the intelligence division in South Africa was £11,000. By comparison, the Boer intelligence division budget, and these guys are poor African farmers, their intelligence division budget is about £90,000. So Britain has absolutely no regard for intelligence.
I wonder why.
In South
I wonder
Africa.
how that bit them in the ass. I mean,
exactly. And so, there's some really interesting lessons here. So what happens is that John Ardagh produces this book. They refuse to read it. And this book's really accurate. And he does this on a budget of £11,000. I mean, it's remarkable. Then, of course, they get their asses kicked. And then John Ardta gets blamed because the General Buller said, well, I never got the good intelligence. Nobody ever gave me the intelligence.
And he's like, the book you sent back.
Honestly, it sounds like your college kids that are like, do I need a book for this class? And then, like, they don't pass it. And they're like, but you didn't tell me any of this stuff. Like,
Because it's in the book. Exactly.
Exactly.
Good God, yes.
But there was basically in 1902, I think, or maybe 1904, there was an inquiry into this, and John Ardta was then. Everyone was like, actually, this guy was really good, and it was General Buller that messed it up, and so that's what we're talking about, right? In the Second Boer War, this is the context in which Churchill rocks up. So Churchill goes as a journalist, and he's writing, and he gets involved in a skirmish where an armored train car gets blown off its tracks, and he helps a bunch of people escape to safety and then is taken prisoner. And then Churchill famously, and Almer Haldane, his friend, is also captured. Well, Churchill famously escapes and is able to kind of sneak around, and everybody raises the fact that Churchill could be tried as a spy at this point, right? Because he's out gallivanting the sort of Boer side of these republics.
I could see that, yeah, from the censorship point of view. It looks really suspect what he's doing.
Exactly. And he eventually winds his way back to the British-controlled territory and becomes a national hero. I mean, this is the real moment that Churchill becomes a household name, because he then becomes
what he's
the
looking
highest.
For.
Yeah, this is what he wants. He then becomes literally the highest paid journalist in British history at this moment. So this is what he wanted, but he also, quite cleverly, also is able to convince General Buller before he's dismissed to sign off on him getting another commission as a lieutenant. So he re-enters the military in a battlefield commission in the South African Light Horse. Exactly, very sneaky. Now, and it's from this point that Churchill enters the battle and goes forth at places like Sion Kop and sort of actively fights the Boers until the end of the war. Bethany, you had a question?
So what I'm trying to understand here is that he went from possibly being tried as a spy to being promoted?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that I'm following and summarizing in my head. Okay. All right, cool.
Clever.
It is a
clever
little,
bit of spin by him.
Yeah. No, I mean, I picked up on that. Good for him. Really good for him.
Could have been really bad for him very quickly.
It was the Boers that were going to hang him, not the British. I just want to make sure that we understand that point. But
okay,
right, because he escaped as a prisoner of war, and rather than because in those days the rules of conduct were if you were captured, and because he had a name, right, Churchill, he would have been held hostage, right? They would have negotiated him. And he escapes, and so the Boers, and you can see to this day, they have copies of the wanted poster that was put out that asked for him alive or dead, and they offered, I think, £25 for his successful capture and return.
25 pounds is nothing, man. Can you imagine just being like, here's Churchill, 25 pounds, that's it?
Yeah, no, I know. And what's also really interesting is when Churchill is in the POW camp, this is remarkable. He says to the leader, "I demand to write to President, the leader of the Boers, who I think is it Kruger or I can't remember the name of the leader of the Boers at this point. It might be Kruger or it might be starts with a D. It doesn't matter. He writes to the thing and demands to be released because he isn't holding a military position. He's only a journalist." And they write back to the prison guards and they say, Winston Churchill is one of the most dangerous men in South Africa. Under no circumstances is he allowed to be released. And when Churchill reads this response, he's like, well, I'm going to leave. And he did. And yet he escaped as a prisoner of war. And then, like I say, successfully gets back to the British-controlled side.
That's badass.
Which is remarkable. Now, again, he sees a lot of action in the Boer War against the Boers, and he leaves and goes and does a by-election in 1900 and gets elected. So he leaves the war behind and isn't there for the really destructive part of the last sort of 2 years of the Boer War. I don't know if you know much about it. Is real nasty shit. Kitchener basically starts putting together concentration camps. The guerrilla war becomes absolutely incredibly mean and difficult. Both sides are doing really vicious stuff to each other. It gets real nasty. And Churchill's able to leave before he gets involved in that. But while he is there, he obviously partakes in a lot of stuff. And he starts writing those essays back again to the military magazine, offering his opinion on what should be done. And I dug one of these things out, and I was looking for it. I don't know if I've got it here with me, but some of the things he argues for, there are two things in particular that are about signals intelligence, just to show that Churchill's thinking about how signals intelligence works, which is, again, a burgeoning field at this moment. So one of these ideas is actually kind of cool and makes a lot of sense. And I'll tell you the good idea first. And that idea was that one of the things that he came to see was, on the battlefield, that the communication between the artillery and the infantry was very poor. And so when the infantry said, hey, you need to bomb this hill, you need to fire on this hill, frequently what would happen was they'd go up the hill and do better than the artillery thought, and the artillery didn't have time to readjust, so they're actually firing on men. So the thing the artillery would be able to communicate these ideas in the battlefield that Churchill came up with was they could use certain plumes of smoke in the ordnance so that people would know the other artillery places would be able to look at this one artillery place and know exactly where to fire, at what angle, and so forth, so as not to hit the troops, which I think is pretty.
I would agree with the smoke, but then that gives away somebody, where you're at. What I'm thinking personally is baseball signal, like when the coaches are on the sideline and they're doing but
there are vast distances, Bethany. These are they're far.
Binoculars.
But
that's a
I just see you with binoculars, Bethany.
No, that's a very good binocular. But I am glad that you pointed that out, Bethany. Now,
thumbs up around the red. Oh yeah, that's an ally. That's an ally. Yep, don't shoot.
That's my own man.
But
he's got a follow-up for this.
The idea about giving away your position, right? Because that is an issue with that. But you could still get around it if you use the right color of plume and so forth.
Okay.
But the other idea he had, and this is remarkably stupid.
Yay! This is my favorite kind of shit.
So Churchill, one of the jobs that he had as a liaison officer, which again is an intelligence thing, he would act as a courier to move between generals. And one of the problems that he identified in this paper was, as a subaltern, it's very difficult to know how to find generals. So when you move from one general to the other, it's difficult to know their positions.
Oh no, I see.
So he came up with a system whereby general positions could be known by raising a balloon. And different colors of balloon would indicate rank, and the bigger the balloon would indicate, general versus colonel and so forth. But at no point,
reveal.
What?
Yeah, it's a gender reveal party.
It's a general reveal.
It's a general
location reveal.
I didn't hear that. It's a general reveal.
General reveal party.
At no point did he ever consider that having a balloon in the air would mean that the enemy would know where your general was. Right?
That's so a t-shirt. That's so the merch right there.
Oh yeah, general reveal party.
I saw.
By the way,
when I saw those balloons in my head, I was like, "Yep."
It just is on a background of a balloon and general reveal party. Also, can I just put it forth that this little snippet alone is what Warren pitched this entire episode off of, and I was like, "Fucking sold."
General reveal party.
Yeah,
no, general reveal party. No, this idea of signals intelligence.
What? If I need to plug up my computer. Here we go. I do have the actual writing.
He's brought sources. I'm excited. He's brought
sources.
visual aids.
I always have sources. So this was published in the military journal, and it's called Some Impressions of the War of South Africa. It's published in 1900, and it's got my notes all over it. I'm going to find so I can just read you so you know how ridiculous this is.
Hey, get yourself back in camera as well.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Yeah, he's done TV, audience.
Yeah, I have.
That's funny, Rip. Yeah, that was the joke.
He's been on the silver screen.
So this is Winston Churchill's own words. I have one more suggestion, which is entirely my own, and which I trust you will not think I put forward in too frivolous a mood. The great difficulty of finding brigand division commanders in the field, I think, comes home to anyone who has been carrying messages in South Africa, especially in the Orange Free State, where the extent of the ground over which the army was spread was most enormous. How are you to find the general, you ask? You're told, I saw him a half an hour here ago, but he galloped over there. It was utterly impossible in many cases for the bearers of important messages to find a hardly visible, the different commanders at different brigades and different divisions. The general's flag was hardly ever visible at such great distances, and when it was visible, it was usually fired at and taken down. So, I mean, he's answering his own problem, and he talks about how the heliograph was no guide, blah, 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 blah.
That sounds like something I would do, though, to be honest, guys. Like, I laugh, but then I think about it, and I'm the kind of person that, like, answers their own questions when they discover a problem. So I'm like, oh no, I'm laughing, but I'm like, oof, that would have been me too. Sending the memo.
This is the golden bit. The only thing that you could see in the Orange Free State at all was a great balloon. You see it 20 miles off, you knew where that was, and you knew where the headquarters was of the army. I do not see why every general should not have his own balloon. One general, one balloon. I would not suggest anything so democratic as they should all have the same size balloon. Each general should have a balloon in proportion to his own rank in the army. You make a very convenient portable balloon about a yard square that could be carried about on a horse by an orderly, and by which would ascend 200 or 300 feet and show distinctly the position of every brigadier. It may be said, would that not draw fire? Very likely it would. But a balloon's a very hard thing to hit. So he's imagining people are going to try to shoot the balloon, not the general.
I mean,
I'm laughing because I'm actually relating to him right now in like my banker sphere, okay? So in my mind, it's like when you have a problem.
But it's true though. Have you seen a balloon in the air? You know what I mean? Like it's hard to shoot. It's moving around. It's like one of those those
dancing guys.
Yeah, but in war, you're not looking for the balloon. You're looking for the enemy. Hopefully, if not, you need Ritalin for the entire brigade.
I would be distracted by a hot pink balloon. That would be my general color. Like, hello.
I guess what intrigues me is the different size balloons. I'm like,
but see, and this is, I bring this up to show you that even great minds like Winston Churchill have really dumb ideas.
Man, I relate. I'm like, I've never felt like I am Churchill before.
So these are some of the takeaways around signals intelligence that I wanted to share with you that he got from the Boer War. And another thing that's really important here, remember his other role was that he was a journalist. He was a war correspondent. Now there's an excellent article that has been written by a guy named Donald P. McCracken, which I also have here, who wrote from Natal. And he did a sort of, I don't know, it's kind of a PhD deep dive on different war correspondents in the Boer War to talk about how shambolic the system was. And bearing in mind that some of these guys are intelligence officers as well, because his what he looks at is the relationship between British war correspondents and military intelligence. And some of the things that he found out was amazing. And one of them is that it was utterly chaotic. I told you how little money went into the intelligence in the Boer War during this phase of the war, right? So nobody knows anything.
Right?
Yeah, 11,000 pounds. He discovered that there is no single centralized list of which war correspondents were even there.
Wow.
It's
So that
all
means
ad
you could
hoc.
just write your name and just be like,
And
I
he
was
brings
there.
up examples where people are like, yeah, I'm with the New York Times, and people be like, okay.
No, it's like literally when the teacher asks you to come up and write down your name, your friend is like, hey, hey, can you write my name down while you're up there? Can you just
Oh, for
sign?
attendance, yeah. Signing the
And-
attendance, yeah.
And
It's-
deuces.
That's interesting, though, because that doesn't just happen during this time period. You see that happening in World War II as well with correspondence,
Yes.
I might add. So it's a common thing.
It is, but I mean, it's so, at least in the Second World War, there's a system by which you deal with it and you verify. Here, it's just like the Wild West. And so one of the things Churchill notices.
It's like Blazing Saddles. I went and he rounds up all the criminals to attack Rock Ridge, and there's just a plethora of all the different groups.
So it's the
Including
people that
Nazis.
are saying they're covering the war, if you
Yeah.
imagine that.
Yeah, sorry, but yeah, no, that's what
No, it is. That's very, very funny. But so it's so shambolic and so chaotic, and Churchill notices this and notices that that's a problem. Now that's something that I'll talk about because we're almost getting to the end of the main war stuff, and then I'll sum up with some final points at the end. But that's one of the lessons is that the situation with the press is really difficult, and Churchill himself had taken so much heat and so many critical letters, and you can see this in the document volumes where generals would write in and say, who the hell is this press correspondent telling us like he knows what our job is? And people were really saying that he can't hold a position as an officer and a war correspondent at the same time. And he got beat up for this in the Malacan Field Force and in the River War, so much so that the British Army agreed to stop allowing officers to be war correspondents. Except, this is one of the reasons he gave up his commission. So that's when he convinces Buller to let him back on as an officer again. He's still a war correspondent. And so he breaks the rules again and is basically out there making a name for himself. And he gets all this hate mail about it. And he's
Can
able
you
to do
imagine
this.
if you're everyone else, though? They see him getting away with something that's like not supposed to be a thing.
No, exactly. And it's because of his name, really. He's got this famous name behind him, and nobody wants to mess with that. A third takeaway for him from the Boer War that plays into that hugely plays into his ethos and thinking about intelligence is, and this is the same thing he saw in Cuba, the strength of a committed guerrilla movement is almost impossible to stop. And the Boers were incredibly powerful and incredibly difficult for the British Army to deal with. And, in many ways ended the era of splendid isolation because Britain realized that it was too weak to hold its empire and had to ally itself with France at the Entente-Cordiale in 1904, all directly because of its failure in the Boer War. And so these are things that Churchill sees are hugely problematic for military intelligence moving forward. So after this period that we've gone through, quite litigiously, that's not the right word, quite meticulously, around him being a war, there are sort of two key points that spew up in 1911 where you can see this stuff coming into the fore. And, this is not us getting into the Second World War or anything, but it's clear to say one of the reasons, and this is something that David Stafford is immensely good at pulling out in his book, is that one of the core takeaways for Churchill was the strength and power of a guerrilla fighting force. And this is one of the reasons he so firmly believed in the SOE in the Second World War, and letting them go to France and just fucking raise hell and blow up bridges and do whatever was because he saw that in the Boer War and in Cuba and in the Northwest frontier and thought, just let them fuck stuff up because that's really hard to deal with.
It is efficient. Yeah, because then you're like basically trying to go around fixing this stuff while trying to fight. So no, it's an incredibly effective tactic, really.
And this is, even though he maybe romanticized it, I don't think it was as effective as he thought that it was, but it is an effective way to fight a war. And this is one of the clear reasons that he did that. The other stuff that gets expressed that we can see early on are in these two moments, and they're both in 1911. So I'm going to start with chronologically the first one, and that's the Sydney the Sydney Street Siege, right? What had happened was a bunch of anarchists got down on City Street, and this is a really historic moment because they're not just anarchists, really. These are real important major players. Some of them are anarchists, some of them are communists, some of them are just bad guys. But they sort of take a place hostage and kind of set up, and there's like a battle, right, in London. And Churchill's Home Secretary at the time and goes down and personally gets interested in this. Now, at the time, he gets beaten up in the press because the Home Secretary has no business at a sort of police action. And a lot of people said he was just trying to make his name. But Churchill was especially interested because Churchill was getting information behind the scenes, right? He had been working with, since he had been colonial secretary, with people like Vernon Kell and Cunningham, who was the first C, the leader of MI6. Vernon Kell is the leader of MI5. That, these guys were real serious people. They were a Latvian gang, and some of the people that were actually there, and this is why I am quite fascinated by it, is the leader of this gang was a sort of communist / anarchist who was the Che Guevara of his day. And he was a man known by a nom de plume called Peter the Painter. And he would go around and put, graffiti on stuff and try to blow things up, and the sort of stereotypical turn-of-the-century anarchist. The problem is, historically speaking, there was no such person. Peter the Painter is like the Dread Pirate Roberts. He's not real. He's a nom de plume. And in fact, who the real power behind this was, according to some historians, and I'm not an expert in this, because some people have said that he could have possibly been actually started out as a Polish guy named Peter Pokrov, who was a sort of committed communist and anarchist, who was Polish, but who we know was definitely there was a guy named George Ganstein, who was himself a Latvian kind of a criminal who goes on later to do stuff. But he's not even the big deal. The big deal, in my opinion, was a guy named Yakov Peters, who also some people speculated was Peter the Painter. Yakov Peters, despite sounding like a comedian in the 1980s, goes on to be a co-founder of the Cheka, which is, of course, the forerunner for the NKVD and the CIA. I mean, the NKVD and the KGB.
There we go.
I was like, that's a twist.
And so the fact that Churchill's out there matching wits with this guy, that later on is going to be one of the major, the Cheka are the people that form this stuff. And these are the same guys that go out and recruit people like Kim Philby and that kind of stuff later in the 30s. So Yakov Peters, and this is another interesting thing, he runs this Cheka and is later killed by Stalin during the purges. So this guy's a major sort of player, and he gets away. He escapes the Sydney Street Siege. And it's interesting to me that Churchill and him had this brief sort of moment where they were sparring, and I find that really fascinating. Now, this experience, as it relates to intelligence, again, Churchill looked at the domestic intelligence situation as Home Secretary and thought, God, this is what it looked like in the Boer War. It's chaotic. We don't know where the aliens are. We don't know, what these guys are capable of. We don't know anything. And so he then tries to introduce a thing called the Alien Prevention of Crime Bill, which basically would put all incoming aliens, it was an addendum to the Aliens Bill of 1905, where he basically tried to put all the incoming aliens on a list, and one of the rule was that they couldn't live within, I think, 10 miles of a military base.
Oh God!
And he uses Vernon Kell, who becomes the leader of MI5, to help put this stuff together. Churchill's working on this stuff behind the scenes, and then he thinks, "Gosh, that's not really enough." And that leads us on to the final point here, where he really tries to push through and does successfully push through with the help behind the scenes of people from the intelligence community. And this is 1911. So I have a question for you. Do you know which office Churchill moved to in 1911?
Are you asking?
I think are you asking us?
Yeah. I'm asking you which office.
I'm sorry, I didn't know there was an interactive portion of this. Like,
Oh, Jessica, I
Sign
know
up
how much you
So
love
wait,
Churchill.
quiz? Is this a pop quiz? Because I don't handle these. I don't handle.
No pressure, no pressure. Okay, I'll tell you. Churchill becomes the first Lord of the Admiralty. Right.
Okay.
Now, this is important, and this is in July. So he's been working as Home Secretary behind the scenes with Vernon Kell and Admiral Cunningham, and they're both in 1909 put in charge of intelligence. MI5, MI6, what we would call that today. And it's at that point, if you look at Admiral Cunningham, that SIS, as we know it formally, is brought in under the Admiralty because Churchill himself is involved in this stuff. It's all very off the books, but Churchill's very interested in this stuff. So he tries to put it under his own purview. And so he tries to push through and does push through with the help of these guys behind the scene, what's called the Official Secrets Act of 1911, which does allow for the keeping of lists about where foreign people live and how close they live and keeping notes on them domestically. So you have this kind of internal paranoia that really kicks off in the First World War. And all this happens in 1911, of course, because of the buildup to the First World War and the arms race with Germany.
I'm sorry. It just leaves a really weird taste in my mouth. Because all I can think of is that's what we do for pedophiles. That's what we do for people that are sexual offenders. They have to register.
That's
I'm
exactly
sorry.
right.
That's just kind of all I get. I was like.
That's a really awesome point, Bethany, and I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
There you go. It's because what you can see that Churchill's collecting here, with the help of Vernon Kell especially, is the very first instance of what you might think of as metadata.
Oh, wow. I know what that is.
And so he's collecting all that on all the incoming aliens that might potentially represent a threat if there's a coming war with Germany.
Wow, why does that sound so fucking familiar?
And so it's essentially, you can see him looking at the chaotic nature of intelligence in South Africa and saying, not in Britain, not on my watch. I'm going to put this shit to order. And I'm going to get the legal framework to do it. And the Official Secret Act is still in place from 1911, is still in place in Britain. And if they can still try people as spies under that act.
Well, isn't that the case, though? We have several laws in place with the Alien and Sedition Acts.
Yes, that's right.
So, I mean,
Correct.
we can't act like the UK is the only place that has those, considering we very much use similar type of.
Oh yeah, I'm not making a moral judgment about it being wrong or right to create.
No,
this.
I just think a lot of people, I could picture listeners thinking, "Oh, look at them."
Listeners are going to, yes, and they shouldn't.
No, oh my God, the United States has alien acts that are infinitely worse. I mean, in the 1920s, they basically outlawed any kind of immigration from anywhere besides Europe. And that held sway until 1967 or something.
Seriously.
I guess what Kara's trying to point out is, because it will come up, glass houses, y'all.
Again, I feel a Blazing Saddles reference coming in, where all the guys all these railroad workers is just a piece of land to call their own, and they're like, no, and they're like,
yeah, no,
except
yes to no, except for he's going to be proved to be right in some cases and wrong in others. So I mean, it's a tricky area, Bethany.
Very interesting to me.
It's Hedy Lamarr. Lamarr.
Hedley.
Oh my God, yes.
Hedy. No, it's Hedy Lamarr. I did an entire appearance on Potaskew about Mel Brooks. I think everybody is well aware at this point.
That's one of the reasons I'm your infinite #fanboy. Is because of your deep Mel Brooks.
Oh.
#Deep Key Thursday.
Deep Key Thursday. And
Deep Key Thursday. Look it up. It's a thing.
Deep Key Fanboy with an I. And Streets with a Z.
Streets with a Z.
Oh, I knew you were going to do that.
I think, I think that you can see the lessons, I hope, from the journey we've taken, that you can see the lessons Churchill was posed with about the evolution of military intelligence in his youth and how it sort of got him. And this is all up just to the First World War. And again, we can talk about the real importance of the learning about guerrilla fighting for the Second World War, but the other things I think he learned and implemented even before the First World War ever took place. So, and these things come to much later in his life in a much bigger way. But we can see these early seeds and the importance of Churchill's relationship with intelligence, really as early as 1911.
Really,
what's
I'm
crazy-
kind of pumped about. Oh, go ahead, Bethany.
Sorry, I was just gonna make a comment. What's interesting to me is knowing when he does during World War II, having more in-depth conversation of what he did during this one, kind of puts it into a little bit more perspective, I guess.
Well, I think Churchill as a correspondent, a soldier, and in some ways a bit of a spy is more interesting even than his maybe less of an
I like the
impact,
war
but definitely
correspondent hat
more
for him.
interesting. Yeah,
Well, he was
I
definitely
do
more.
too.
He was definitely more in the shit, but like not like. I mean, yeah, obviously he did the cavalry and he had a gunfight. Like he kind of dabbled. Literally, he was your jack of all trades back then. He dabbled in a little bit of everything, which makes sense to what he became. Like
Which is
Well, I've
a
always
big part of what makes him successful later on. I think you're going to. One could argue.
That's what I was gonna say. Yeah.
I absolutely agree with that. And to Bethany's point, I've always tried to argue and raise the idea that there should be a series on young Churchill's life, and it would be like half Indiana Jones, half Downton Abbey, and I think people would love it. And I've actually written a sort of not what do they call it? A treatise, not a treatise, not a screenplay, but a screen precis, which I've actually given. And maybe someday will turn into something, but we'll see.
More importantly, I think we just got the pitch for you and Richard's podcast.
We call that fan fiction. Okay, let's just call it what it is. Okay.
That timing was brilliant.
That was good. That's true.
One thing I'm very glad. I think this is an excellent follow-up companion series to you. The first series you did. I think it goes very well as a follow-up. As always, I'm pumped about that. But as we know, and as our listeners know, I'm deeply mired in Nancy Wake, and we're about to get to why this exact shit and what Churchill is talking about forming planning is going to be important to the story of one Miss Nancy Wake. So
It's
I'm
almost
actually
like you should have had him
glad.
on Nancy Wake.
It's almost as if I should have had Warren Doctor on Nancy Wake. But he's so fancy and important, listeners.
I'll come
see
talk
my
about
hand
anything.
up. I see my hand up.
Oh, your hand is up.
Okay, so I have a comment to make back with the signal stuff. So I'm not sure if you've seen it. I'm sure you probably have. But 1917, one of the most critical moments in that movie is when he is trying. You can't hear me, can you?
I can hear you. Keep going.
Oh, sorry. So one of the most critical moments, spoiler alert, in 1917 is when he's trying to get them to stop the attack. And when he's trying to communicate and they keep saying, oh, he's down the line. And when he finally communicates the message,